Greetings. Welcome to Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a reflection for the first Sunday of Lent, which is largely focused on the gospel reading, which is Jesus being baptized and driven into the wilderness. So I'm starting all over again, by the way. This is the second, or third try at a sermon, because the first one just did not seem right. It may have been okay if we weren't in our 11th month of a pandemic, but context is everything, right? We don't need the Holy Spirit, you and I, to drive us into the wilderness, because we've been wandering in it for a while now. We just want the other side of all this. We're like those ancient escaped slaves brought by Moses through the wilderness to the far banks of the Jordan River. They could look across that small meandering boundary, but weren't allowed to cross over. They had to sit down and listen to yet another sermon when right across that muddy way was a land of milk and honey. Slowly but surely, chaotically and maddeningly, we're getting vaccines. Hope for the other side is named July or the end of summer or by next fall. But we're here on this side with the threat and memories of sickness and variances and deaths. For many of us, our loved ones are very far away, even if we can see them through the plasma of a screen. Good friends must keep distance and smiles go unseen. Favorite cafes, bars, restaurants have closed. We are close, but yet so very far. For some of us, the wilderness is knowing that our pain is so much less than most people's suffering. Millions and millions and millions and millions have lost work, live tenuously in the shadow of back rent and food lines, or worse. Around the world, the pandemic has only deepened the isolation of those suffering extreme deprivation. We see it. We know it. We do not live it, and are far from being able to do anything about it. In that scenario, we are in the land of milk and honey, but looking back across the Jordan at those still in the wilderness. Yet, somehow, we feel as though we're wandering in the wilderness still. And we are. Such is the strangeness of this time. Now, obviously, the boilerplate for Lent comes from the gospel story about Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. But he had angels waiting on him. That's no fair. There's yet another thing to notice, though, about that story, at least in Mark, because it is a parfait of love and suffering. First, he has a private religious experience, a voice in his head. Now remember, in Mark, it is only Jesus that hears the voice. In his head, the voice tells him that he is beloved. Beloved. That peak spiritual and emotional experience, that embrace, is then followed immediately with some kind of harsh wind that transports him out into a wild and desolate place. It wasn't a polite liturgical invitation to Lent. It was coercion. In the midst of the wildness, home to beasts and the darkness of his own shadows, he does get some TLC from angelic counterforces. But then, right after that, his spiritual mentor and prophet like him is arrested. So, from that spiritual high of intense experience, both light and dark, he now must decide whether the risks are worth it. Apparently he does, and he goes off preaching. Now, just as an aside, Mark is a very economic storyteller. He describes all of that action in 7 sentences. Our tradition unfortunately lumps Mark in with Matthew and Luke, and so we lose Mark's point of view. For Mark, Jesus was totally human. He had a spiritual awakening as an adult. He knew he was beloved by God, and it empowered him to do what needed to be done. And just an FYI, Mark never proclaims Jesus as the only Son of God. The earliest gospel does not make that case, nor offer any notion of supernatural birth or extraordinary beginning. To Mark, Jesus was a human being like us. He was a human being who had an intense awakening and allows that awakening to change him. It's much that the story of Jesus for Mark is much like Noah, Abraham, and Moses. Now, when I'm in the wilderness and I need a guide and a hand to hold, I would prefer a prophet and Messiah like Mark describes than one that Paul and John proclaims. But that's just me. So now, back to our wilderness wandering. In normal times, the wisdom that I think I want to follow is community. Community is a spiritual practice, It's a wisdom. It's the practice of interdependence. In order to practice community, we have to run interference with the demons of individualism and self-sufficiency that whisper that we don't need others, especially those others we don't like. You know those beasts, right? They insist that we resist vulnerability, that nobody is to be trusted, and then we have to look out for number one. We do. Number one. We are number one. And nobody else will. Those beasts that I'm talking about. They make it difficult, if not impossible, for us to practice community. Now, the practice of community involves throwing our lot in as with others as if our well-being and survival is dependent upon them. As if we're all in this together. As if we're dependent upon those who harvest crops and slaughter the meat and drive the produce and stock the shelves and sell us the food. As if we're dependent on those folks. Right. That practice of community also involves an intentional and continuous choice to live connected to people we don't even like, people we don't agree with, people we don't want to be connected to. All of that's required because it's real. It's very real. Interdependence is the actual nature of the universe, and it does not consider whether the elements in play like each other or agree with each other or not. So you see, the practice of community is big and complicated, and it's even a comprehensive practice that includes our economic choices and our political choices and our social choices just as much as it does our personal choices. That's why there are so many beasts and demons at work that want to keep us from practicing the wisdom of community. There's a lot of room in there for those shadows to fly around and create havoc. But community, making it 40 days, a community making it 40 days in the wilderness together, like those escaped slaves did, seems a lot more realistic than waiting for 40 days in the wilderness for the angels to arrive. We are all in this together. We're all in this together where we want to be or not. We will do far better practicing community than waiting for the angels. Plus, it's usually in the practice of community that we encounter our belovedness. It's there that we discover, that we hear and know that we are beloved. And we usually have that experience just after we've run into our beasts and demons. So, community is practiced a bit differently during a pandemic, of course. But the alternative is awful isolation that makes social distancing seem like child's play. So welcome to Lent and to a communal practice of wilderness wandering together. Peace be with you.